My name is Mike Titus, and I will be talking about really ways of templating Docker. I'll start with some simple ways of doing that without Ansible, and then I'll talk about running Ansible manually on Docker containers or Docker images, and then also using the Packer build tool. Let's do a quick audience survey. How many people are using Ansible in production right now? And how many people have experimented with it but they have a little familiarity but not a lot? Okay. And then the same with Docker in production, and have played with Docker, experimented with it. Okay, good. So Docker files, they are single documents, and the design philosophy is that the Docker file is a single point of truth about the Docker image. There are some problems with that. I mean, it's nice to be able to look at a single file, single source, and know exactly what's going to end up in the running container. But that doesn't lend itself to code reuse, to assembling images using small modular pieces of code. If you have a lot of different Docker images, you can end up cutting and pasting the same configurations or the same base configurations from one Docker file to another. So we don't generally like to do that. It violates the do not repeat yourself principle. There is a limited way of having a common library in a Docker file, and that's the initial from directive, where you can create your own. You can take somebody else's base image, take your own base image, and use that across multiple Docker files. That lets you compose using just a single shared piece of code. So this talk is about ways of getting around that. There is no include directive in a Docker file. It's something that has been discussed at length and has been requested frequently from the community. The first pull request for that was created 3 years ago. It's one of the most actively discussed pull requests in the Docker project. There are comments as recently as 2 or 3 days ago, and these, a lot of the majority of the comments. There have been some really long and interesting posts in that pull request. A lot of those comments are simply +1, or now the new, you can do the thumbs up in a Google pull request, GitHub pull request. So it's still being voted on, it's still being discussed, even though just about a year ago, Docker said they're not going to do that. They've frozen the Dockerfile syntax. And the reason for that is described in their Docker roadmap, which I'm quoting from here. They want to separate the builder from the rest of the engine, and once that is done, they think that will open the way for end-user customization, end-user custom syntaxes, end-user domain-specific languages. So I think that would be a really interesting development. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't know what the status of that is. Does anybody know how close that is to happening? How far they've gotten on separating the builder from the rest of the engine? Yeah, there doesn't seem. I couldn't find much discussion on it other than we want to do this someday. So until that happens, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen soon, there are other ways that there are a number of other ways that you can kind of fake having an include directive. One of the simplest is using the envsubst command. This is a command line utility that's installed by default in Ubuntu, and I think Debian, and probably a number of other distros. This is a GNU utility. And all this does is it's going to look for what it does is it reads from standard out and writes to standard, or reads from standard in and writes to standard out. It doesn't even read a text file directly, and it's going to look for environmental variable declarations in either of these two formats, and it'll replace them and pipe it to standard out. So you can define your environmental variables on the command line prior to invoking envsubst. This can be a list of variables. Obviously, If you've got a lot of substitutions, this becomes unwieldy very quickly. But if you've just got one or two parameters that you want to change, and if you've got a Dockerfile template, if you've just got one or two, I think this works well. And the way I've written this, I'm not even piping it to an intermediate output file. I'm just piping it directly to Docker build. So that lets you keep a single Docker file template on your file system and not clutter it up with kind of intermediate templatized versions. If you've got a lot of variables to substitute, you can write a simple shell script and define them in this format in the shell script. And envsubst calls this the shell format, and this works a little bit differently from this type of invocation. In this first invocation, if you're passing in var here, but if your Dockerfile template also has variables that are already defined in the environment, such as $path, etc., it will replace those as well. So anything that finds in this template file that is in this format, if it can find an environmental variable, it's going to replace it. This is a little safer, a little more controlled. It's only going to substitute these variables if it finds them. If this Dockerfile has a $path in it, it's going to be ignored and it will be left unchanged using this format. So a couple different ways of doing that. Very limited kind of search and replace. You can get a lot fancier with the M4 macro utility. A lot fancier. And I'm not going to go into too much because there's a lot there that I've never used. This slide and the next slide are from a blog post by Bobby Norton. It's very very interesting blog post. Check it out. So M4 and Make are of course installed, I think by default in most distros. This is a very simple example where we're just reusing the include directive in M4, and we're bringing in a couple of components. So we're building our Dockerfile from small reusable pieces of code. You can do a lot more with M4. There are all kinds of variable substitution. You can define a variety of macros within the M4 file. It can do recursion. It can do conditionals. There's not much you can't do with it. Anyway, how many people have used M4? Okay, I actually have not used it. I came across it when I was looking at this or researching this topic, and so it's any comments? Is it worth learning? Is it just a headache?
It's 30 years old.
It's really dated.
It's written powerful for different years.
It's part of the whole logo tool.
Okay.
Just use your favorite Python, Perl, Ruby, whatever, and whatever template is built into that. 1,000 times simpler, it'll still do.
Yeah, I believe that. I managed to omit a slide on doing Python or any other modern templating languages. Obviously, I think you can whip up something with whatever language you're familiar with without too much trouble. And of course, you can get even fancier and combine M4 with Make, or probably even your own templating language of choice, and just do Make build and generate an image and not deal with the generated templatized Docker files. Okay, so finally we're getting to Ansible. Let me ask you why you would want, or why you think you want to combine Ansible with Docker. A little audience participation here.
Because Ansible is a heck of a lot more flexible than every other option you mentioned.
I think so. I'm very fond of Ansible. So yeah, it's very flexible. It's got a lot of different things you can do with it. Here's some of the reasons I came up with. If like we do at work, we had, before we started playing with Docker, we had a large investment in Ansible playbooks. We've got a lot of playbooks. We've got a lot of roles. We've got a lot of individual server types. and I think, and we're not really using microservices. If we were to go to microservices, the number of roles and playbooks would explode, I expect. So it's a way of, you've got all this work you've done and you want to start transitioning to Docker, but you don't want to do a big bang and toss everything out and write everything from scratch. That is often difficult to have success. Roles are, here's your modularity or your code reuse. Maybe you want to take you've got a playbook and for some reason you've got to have multiple targets. You want not just a Docker file, but you want a Vagrant file. How many people are using Vagrant? You're going to build to EC2. That's what we started out doing. All of our Ansible playbooks were building to EC2 instances. Maybe you've got bare metal, you've got a different cloud provider, and you can, the nice thing about Ansible is without very many changes, you can generate all of these. You can build all of these endpoints. You can have, let's say you can have plain Docker files that aren't templated and still use Ansible as a deployment tool. You can use Ansible to kind of, as an infrastructure as code, to build up whatever environment that the Docker containers are going to be running in. So there's kind of a lot of different ways to use the two, directly with each other or kind of indirectly, really depending on your use case. So probably the simplest and most naive way to do it is run, you've got a base Docker image, you run a container from that, and then you configure Ansible to SSH into that container. Obviously the container has to support SSH. Many containers don't. You can get passionate arguments about whether that's a good idea or bad. But you can treat the running Ansible container as if it was an EC2 instance or bare metal, and you really don't have to even think about Ansible interacting with the Docker file. Another little trick you can do is you've run your Docker container, you've configured Ansible, and then you can actually generate a new configured image from that running container using Docker commit, and then go off and do things with that. I think more often people will run Ansible inside a container and use Ansible to configure the container itself. Basically, you're running Ansible against localhost. This can be a little expensive in terms of the container weight. It adds, installing Ansible and all the Python dependencies adds almost 200 megabytes to the image size. And a lot of people, when they're using, one of the reasons they're using Docker is to control image size and to get the size of their virtual images as small as possible. So this is a way of sacrificing image size for convenience. And this little syntax trick, I don't know if people know about. Sure, go ahead.
Oh, well, isn't it possible once your Docker file is run Ansible and got everything set up to somehow, I don't know, pip uninstall or whatever you need to do and shrink the image, or does that not work?
You can kind of compress everything. You can take multiple images and compress them into a single image.
No, I don't mean that. I
Yeah.
mean take a running image and then delete files from it and then build a newer, hopefully smaller image from that.
I think you can do that. I have not tried that personally.
No.
No. Okay.
No?
Somehow it doesn't
Each
surprise me.
image only can add files.
Right,
That's right. Yeah.
because
So you've got
UFS works.
Yeah. You're building writable layers on top of.
You
Okay.
export it and re-import it, then you get a flat image, but it's not got the things in that image. But it doesn't have any of the history, so you can only use that image to build from, not the one below. So it depends what you need.
Just a little trick: if you're running Ansible against localhost, you don't need to define an inventory file, and yes, you need the comma. It's kind of exploiting a little bug in Ansible that they've left in place because it's useful. And this is formatted wrong. But if you're running an Ansible playbook against localhost and you're skipping the inventory file and using this little argument here, set hosts to all, and that works nicely. and then you define the rest of your tasks and variables, etc. as normal. So that's if you're kind of doing things manually with Ansible and Docker. And you can also, if you're going to do this, there are Docker images on Docker Hub. The Ansible, the official Ansible repos, by the way, have been deprecated. So they tell you in great big, like 72-point text, don't use our images anymore. This is the most popular one right now. Within that repo, there are images for Debian, Debian, Ubuntu, CentOS, and Alpine. With a quick search, I didn't find anything for SUSE, but I'm sure they must exist somewhere. So ignore the official Ansible repos on Docker Hub. So Packer, this is moving to a more formal build tool, a more formal build system to run Ansible playbooks against a Docker image. Now, how many people have used Packer? Okay, and Packer is by HashiCorp, which is also they've created Vagrant. That was their first product that has been very successful. They created Console and Vault, which is distributed systems for managing configuration, distributed key value store, and then Vault can encrypt that. So a lot of people are using Console plus Vault for SSH and database credential management. I really like their tools. I think they're up to about 8 different tools now. So we've been using Packer in production for maybe a year, maybe a little less. And Packer it's a tool for generating not just Docker containers, but a variety of machine images. And a Packer configuration file can actually generate multiple different images kind of in parallel. There are a few miscellaneous Packer directives I'm not going to talk about, but the main ones are builders, and the builder determines what type of image you're going to generate. And as you can see, there's a variety, and that list up there is not exhaustive. Once you are generating the machine image, provisioners can do things to that image. They can install software, they can change configurations, etc. All of like the 4 big configuration management tools, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, Salt. You've got both the Windows PowerShell, you've got the Bash shell. There are a few others there that I haven't listed. Post processors, once you've completed generating the image, once you've completed configuring it, you can take that image and you can do various things with it. You can send it to Amazon, you can push it to a Docker registry, not just Docker Hub. If you've got a different registry you're using, you can push it there. Typically you use Docker push and Docker tag in conjunction. So tag the image, push it all kind of at once. You can you can send it to Vagrant. And all of these are Packer was built to be really modular, so it's got plugins. Every single one of these is a plugin. They just happen to be plugins that are compiled into the executable. But you can certainly write your own plugins if you've got to, if you're doing something a little unusual, or if there's something that they haven't done yet that you want to use and you are motivated, you can certainly write your own builder, your own provisioner, your own post processor. I don't know how hard that is. I haven't tried it. I haven't looked at the code for the plugins, but it's from day one they wanted end users to be able to do that if they felt the need. This is an example of a Packer configuration file. It's JSON format. Each of these is an array. You've got an array of builders. You have to have at least one builder. An array of provisioners, these are optional. You can have 0 to n. And an array of post processors, also optional, 0 to n. Pay attention to the fact that there's actually an array inside of the array here. I've never fully understood the syntax, but if you don't get it right, it doesn't work right. I cannot remember the reason off the top of my head, but this was something I struggled with when I first began writing Packer files. So what we're doing in this example, we're going to build a Docker image. This is the base image that we're going to pull. And then we're going to commit this as an image. You can actually take a Docker image and then turn it into a tarball if you want. There are a couple other arguments here that seem to be very special case. I'm not going to go into them. Provisioners, Ansible local. There's as from the previous list, there's a bunch of different provisioners. You can run multiple provisioners against one of these images. There's also kind of a conditional flag where you can build multiple images in parallel and run a provisioner against one and not the others, and vice versa. When you're using Ansible, I'll get into a little more detail on Ansible local on a different slide. And here we're combining the Docker tag. Actually, I'm not showing the Docker push. So this is not going to push it to remote hub, but it will tag it locally. And this is the finished Docker image name. Any questions so far? Okay, there are originally in Packer there was a single Ansible provisioner. It was called Ansible local, and this was running Ansible inside the image against localhost. So your base image that you started with, it had to have Ansible installed and all the supporting libraries. This will copy. You direct it to where your Ansible directory structure is, and it's going to import that whole Ansible directory structure into the image. So if you've got a really huge Ansible tree with lots of different roles, lots of different submodules, it's going to pull all of that in and increase the image size. Here's a slightly more detailed example of the Ansible local provisioner. Again, the type. What's nice about it is that it supports all of the command line arguments that you can pass to Ansible. So that includes skip tags, extra vars, anything you do on the command line for Ansible, you can also do in Packer. Inventory groups, you've got when it's looking at the playbook file here, the playbook file is going to declare a host group, and what Packer will do is you give it a list of host groups that you want to map to local hosts. So Packer kind of does that on the fly for you. So if you've got an Ansible inventory file that points out to EC2 instances, your playbook is referencing those groups or those instances. You can list them here, and then you don't have to rewrite anything in the inventory file to say, okay, we're actually going to use localhost. And this can be a comma separated list of multiple hosts if that's what your playbook is doing. Group vars and host vars have to be, I believe, are not. Somebody correct me on. I've been doing this for a long time. I believe they're not imported automatically. But you can specify a path to them if the playbook needs it. Here I've got these in a parent directory. I've stuck all my Packer files in a subdirectory underneath the Ansible project. So I'm just kind of pointing up the tree and saying, okay, here's the whole playbook directory, and here's the particular playbook file. And from this, it's going to find this playbook there is going to find the roles. Any questions there? So Ansible local. This was actually, I meant to say, this was added to Packer very early on. Kelsey Hightower wrote this. He's been very active in Kubernetes and some of the other very interesting technologies. So it's been around a long time, but it had the disadvantage of really loading up your image with Ansible and the supporting libraries. So in just a few months ago in Packer 090, they introduced the Ansible remote provisioner. So this is using Ansible on your host machine, and it's kind of going back to the idea of if you're manually running Ansible against a running Docker container, but this gives you a little more power. It's a little cleaner. It kind of dynamically generates an inventory file. It's going to run SSH server on the target image or the image that it's generating. It's going to automatically set up SSH keys for you. It kind of handles, it makes it really easy. And it will, it uses SFTP for file transfers. You often need, to make this work, I don't have a running example of this. I'm going to do a little demo of Ansible local afterwards. I couldn't get this working in the last couple of days. There was some extra configuration that has to go in the Ansible config file to let it know that you're going to do SCP over SFTP. So it's not, the Packer side kind of runs out of the box, but you still need to tweak Ansible a little bit for this. So there's some fewer directives here in a typical use case. Again, we're going to specify the playbook file, tell it what groups get mapped to localhost. Still supports extra arguments. The type is Ansible instead of Ansible local. I think the documentation calls this Ansible remote. I kind of wish they had named it Ansible remote, but that's just a minor quibble. Not shown here, but there are additional configuration options. Or if you want to manage your own SSH keys, if you want to use alternate SFTP servers, if you want to specify an alternate port that Packer will interact with Docker on. Those all seem rather advanced, and I haven't felt the need to use them. Any questions before I do a brief demo? We've got a lot of time left. I didn't think I had a full hour of material here.
Yeah, on the Ansible example you gave, you're using relative path names. Is that best practice, or would using fully qualified be better, or would they get in the way?
I think it kind of depends on your own preferences. Either works, obviously. For myself, I'm using relative path names because I'd already had a fairly elaborate Ansible structure, and I've got all my Packer configuration files off on their own little subfolder. So it was just, for me, a matter of convenience. At this example, you don't even need to, you can kind of put everything in the same folder, and you don't need to worry about paths at all. It'll assume the same current directory. Anything else? Okay, we'll so I've got a here's a JSON file for a little Packer demo. We're using Docker, of course. I've got my own base image, which really I just took a Fusion base image, which is very popular, but it's often several months out of date. So when we work with that or any other third-party base image in production, we've got a cron that just rebuilds it every night. And by rebuilding, we pull the image and we run apt-get update and apt-get dist upgrade. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of security vulnerabilities that can go unpatched for a long time. Ansible local provisioner. The Ansible playbook file is here, playbook directory, the current directory, and I'm going to generate a new Docker image called LFNW. LFNW playbook is incredibly crude. It seemed like some of the fancier stuff I wanted to do were so slow that I wasn't sure if it was going to work on this network. So I'm really wimping out and just going to copy a text file into the Docker image. Packer build doesn't take very many command line options, if any at all. It's very simple to use. And so what it's doing is pulling the image, and it's setting up the image, running it and in a way it's hidden from you and setting it up.
Is this one of the images that has Docker in it, or are you running remote?
It's an image that I added Docker to manually. It's not.
Sorry, Ansible, you added
Yeah,
Ansible to
yeah. So I added Ansible to it manually.
Okay.
So we've run the playbook. It just has a single task. It's just copied one file, and we updated the LFNW image. And if I run that, so that's all I've got. We've got a bit more time. Any questions, observations, anything people want to discuss about Docker and Ansible, or either one of those by itself? Go ahead.
Yeah, 2 questions. So, will you post your slides?
Yes.
Okay. Second one is, could you talk a bit about like why this is the right tool for you? Are you at GitHub? Is that what?
No, I'm not at GitHub. I work here in Bellingham at a company called Conversica.
Okay. I was
And-
wondering if you could talk for a minute about why this is the right tool for you in production.
Sure. So we wrote, when I started working there, we had a very large number of servers, EC2, and all our servers are in EC2, AWS EC2. They had all been manually configured by sysadmins who didn't have a lot of development experience. So we spent a couple of years writing lots of Ansible playbooks for all of the servers, and a lot of that was kind of forensic analysis. What exactly got put on the server? What is really necessary for the application that's running on that server? You know, there were a lot of libraries that were installed at one point, and then code changed and wasn't necessary anymore. So there was a big investment in labor in these playbooks, and what we're doing now is we're exploring Docker. We're using Docker to generate images for QA testing. We're not using them in production yet. So we wanted a way to generate Docker images for all of our repos, for all of our application images fairly quickly. We could have tried rewriting everything in Dockerfile from the beginning, but we didn't. You know, for a proof of concept, that was going to be an expensive project. Not 100% sure that we were going to commit to Docker when we started it, and we're still not 100% sure now. As I said, we're using it for QA. There's no short-term plan to actually get those in production. So we had an Ansible role that we called common that we just ran against every single one of our instances, and that did things like, you know, it set up fail to ban, and it did just kind of a lot of low-level stuff, installed just command line utilities that the admins liked and so forth, and some of the really basic PHP and Python libraries that we needed. So that got moved into our Dockerfile for what we call Conversica base, and everything that all the Ansible playbooks that we are running against Docker, they pull from the Conversica base to begin with. And we had to make almost no changes to our Ansible playbooks to begin running them against the this base image, because we were doing things, and let me bring this presentation back up. We were doing things, we were making heavy use of skip tags, because there were a number of things a number of our Ansible roles, you know, a typical playbook, we've got anywhere between 6 and 15 roles that comprise that playbook. So obviously the common role, it's not shown here, but we wanted to exclude that because that's already in the Docker base image. Things like, you know, we're installing Datadog in each EC2 instance, but you don't want to do that in a Docker container because A, it's very heavyweight, and that's not really what Datadog was meant to do. You want Datadog running on the host machine that your Docker containers are running on, but not inside Docker. So using skip tags, we were able to really adapt our playbooks to our needs for Docker without hardly changing them at all. Obviously, we had to create like a Docker common role and a couple other things around that, a Docker build role, so that when we're merging code, Now we've got a role that builds it to the target EC2 instance, and we've got a different role that builds it to an updated Docker image. So that's all the work that we had to do with Ansible to suddenly have Docker versions of every single one of our application servers. And this is obviously an ongoing process. What we're doing, once our initial Ansible playbooks were just configuring a server. Just like, here are the users, here are the applications, the dependent libraries. That's all we were doing there. Now what we're doing is that we're moving towards infrastructure as code. So we're moving more higher level configs into our Ansible playbooks. We're setting things like EC2 security groups are now defined from the Ansible playbook. You know, those have been handled manually for a long time just through the AWS console. They were out of date. There were lots of open IP addresses in them that we didn't even have control of over anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all in the Ansible playbooks now. Things like DNS is probably something, DNS management, we're going to add very soon. So I see, long term with this process, I see our Ansible playbooks doing more infrastructure as code and less server config. And I see more and more server config getting moved into more Docker files. But it's just a way of, it was a way of trying this out, getting it going, and continuing on with all of the non-experimental stuff that we have to do day to day. And letting Ansible continue to do configure our production instances. So I think obviously different people are going to be in different positions. Some people, if you've got 2 or 3 Docker files, if you've got 2 or 3 Ansible playbooks, you don't have a lot of different server types. It might just make sense to just rewrite them in Docker. Write the Docker file and kind of say, Ansible, it was, thanks for the memories. It was good to know you. It depends a lot on what you need. Go ahead.
You were starting out earlier about talking about the attempt or the stated goal to separate the Docker build into where there's just basically APIs.
Yeah.
And then people could build their own tools, their own DSLs and so forth. Wouldn't that basically imply then that Ansible could just hook right into those APIs and you could use your Ansible files to directly build a Docker image that way?
That would make a lot of sense. I don't know what the technical challenges would be, but I would expect that if and when Docker released, a separate builder and that had out of the box the ability to create your own DSL, I would expect people to use that very quickly for things like Ansible and Salt. But again, I have no idea what the technical challenges would be, but that would be really nice. That would help a lot. Well, the counter argument to that, let's say that you've got it in Packer, and now Docker has released the ability to do DSL, so your Docker file can now be a native Ansible playbook. You might still want to stay with Packer if you've got other machine images you also have to generate. Again, it's going to be, everybody's going to have slightly different needs for that. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you for attending. You can evaluate the session here. The slides will be up soon. A lot of them have been getting up the same day, but I haven't actually sent them my slides yet. I will do that this afternoon. Thanks a lot.